Spain's treasure fleets carried enough silver in a single voyage to bankrupt a kingdom, and they did, repeatedly. For 3 centuries, the accepted story was simple. Spain discovered the New World, extracted vast quantities of precious metals, shipped them home, and became the wealthiest power on earth. The treasure fleets, the flotas, were the arteries of that empire. They moved gold and silver across the Atlantic with military precision. The metals arrived in Seville, Cadiz, and beyond. Spain's coffers swelled, its armies marched, its wars were financed. Case closed. But that narrative obscures a darker financial reality. The treasure didn't stay in Spain. Most of it left almost immediately, shipped to creditors, foreign bankers, and military suppliers across Europe. Spain was perpetually broke despite holding the largest supply of precious metal in the known world. The fleets didn't make Spain rich, they made Spain dependent. The system began in the early 1500s. Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire in 1521. Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca in the 1530s. Both discoveries revealed something Europe had never seen: silver and gold in quantities that dwarfed anything previously extracted. The Spanish crown immediately organized mining operations in Mexico and Peru. By the 1540s, the silver mines at Potosí in the Andes were producing roughly half of the world's silver supply. Getting that silver home required an unprecedented logistical operation. The crown couldn't risk sending individual ships across the Atlantic. Pirates, storms, and rival navies made the voyage lethal, so Spain organized the flota system. Multiple merchant vessels, sometimes dozens, traveled together under military escort. Galleons, heavily armed merchant ships, protected the convoy. The fleet sailed on a fixed schedule, departing from Cadiz or Seville and returning on a predetermined route. The quantities were staggering. A single fleet in 1595 carried over 2 million pesos of silver, worth roughly $50 million in modern terms. Fleets sailed twice yearly when conditions allowed. Some years brought 2 fleets back, some years brought none. Weather, war, and piracy disrupted the schedule constantly, but when the fleets arrived, they brought transformative wealth, at least temporarily. Here's where the narrative cracks. The Spanish crown had a problem. It was always at war, fighting the Ottoman Empire, fighting France, fighting the Dutch revolt, fighting Protestant powers across Europe. These conflicts were expensive. Armies required constant supply. Fortifications required constant maintenance. The crown borrowed heavily against future fleets, promising creditors repayment from the next shipment of silver. By the 1550s, Spanish kings were borrowing from Genoese bankers, German merchant houses, and Flemish financiers. The terms were brutal. Interest rates ran between 20% and 40% annually. The crown borrowed against silver that hadn't yet been mined, shipped, or even unloaded. This created a vicious cycle. More silver arrived, but more of it went to creditors. The crown fell deeper into debt. Philip Roman II, Spain's king from 1556 to 1598, inherited a debt of roughly 6 million ducats. By his death, that debt had grown to over 180 million ducats. He declared bankruptcy 4 times. 4 times. Each declaration defaulted on debts to foreign creditors. Each default triggered a crisis in European banking. The Genoese bankers who had funded Spain's wars nearly collapsed. The financial system of Europe shook. The treasure fleets paradoxically made this worse. Because the silver flowed in regularly, if unpredictably, creditors kept lending. They believed the next fleet would bring repayment. The crown kept borrowing because the next fleet would arrive eventually. This created a structural trap. Spain had access to more wealth than any nation on earth, yet remained perpetually insolvent. The silver also caused inflation across Europe. More precious metal in circulation meant that the purchasing power of every coin declined. Prices rose. Wages didn't keep pace. The common people felt the squeeze, even though they never saw the treasure. The fleets had drained Spanish America of its wealth and exported both the metal and the economic instability across the Atlantic. The system also created a profound dependency. Spain's economy became structured around the fleets. Agriculture and manufacturing declined. Why develop local industries when you could import goods purchased with silver? Spain became a pass-through for wealth rather than a generator of it. The metal enriched foreign merchants and bankers far more than Spanish subjects. By the 1650s, Spain's military dominance was visibly declining. The Dutch had won their independence. France was rising as a rival power. Spain's armies, despite the silver, couldn't sustain their advantage. The treasure had financed wars that Spain ultimately lost. The fleets had enabled a century of military spending that exhausted the nation while enriching its creditors. The real explanation for Spain's paradox lies in understanding wealth differently than the crown did. Precious metals are not wealth, they're a medium of exchange. True wealth comes from production, innovation, trade networks, and economic structure. Spain had metal but lacked the systems to convert it into sustainable power. The fleets brought silver, but silver alone doesn't build empires. Meanwhile, England and the Dutch developed different approaches. They built merchant fleets that generated profit through trade rather than extraction. They developed banking systems that channeled capital into productive ventures. They invested in manufacturing and agriculture. Over the long term, these approaches created sustainable wealth. Spain had the silver, but not the system. The Spanish treasure fleets shaped global empires not by enriching Spain, but by demonstrating the limits of extraction-based wealth. They moved metals that temporarily financed wars and diplomatic ventures, but they created inflation that destabilized Europe. They generated debt that persisted for centuries. They made Spain dependent on a single resource and a single system. By 1700, Spain's silver fleets were declining in frequency and volume. The mines were producing less. The crown's debts were insurmountable. The empire that had dominated the 16th century was now a secondary power. The treasure had run out not because the ships stopped arriving, but because the system that depended on them could never be satisfied. The lesson embedded in this history is this: access to resources doesn't guarantee wealth or power. Systems matter more than stocks. How you use what you have determines outcomes, not how much you have. Spain's treasure fleets carried enough metal to reshape the world. Instead, they revealed how easily abundance can become a trap. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Subscribe to explore more episodes where economic history reveals how systems, not resources alone, shape the rise and fall of empires. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.